One of the defining features of human nature is our ability to make difficult decisions. The decisions we make every day shape our education, careers, relationships, and even our health. But what situations make decisions harder to make? And what brain systems are involved in decision making? Several researchers were interested in these questions and decided to study the neural systems that respond to degrees of uncertainty in human decision making. Alex Simmons, Sophia Melendez, and Madison Mailhot will be taking you through this study.
This paper is based on something called decision theory. According to this theory, decisions are based on two factors, one being the judged probabilities of possible outcomes, and the second being the evaluation of those outcomes. So according to this theory, the confidence regarding those probabilities should not influence the final choice. According to this study, there are two types of uncertain events, risky and ambiguous. A risky event would be something like a roulette wheel, where the probability can be confidently judged from the relative frequencies, whereas an ambiguous event would be something like an earthquake, where the probability cannot be confidently judged due to missing information. Experiments have shown that people are generally more willing to bet on risky outcomes than on ambiguous ones, with the judged probability of outcomes held constant. There is therefore an empirical aversion to making ambiguous decisions. There's been a great deal of research as to how people make decisions under varying levels of risk. However, up until now, there's been a lack of research studying how people make decisions when probabilities are uncertain or ambiguous because of missing information. This study addressed the gap in the literature by asking, what is the neural basis of decision-making under conditions of ambiguity? The researchers in this study hypothesized that neural activity correlates with the level of uncertainty when making decisions. They focused on three brain areas based on previous findings on reward and uncertainty. First was the striatum, which has been implicated in reward anticipation. Then the orbitofrontal cortex, which has been implicated in uncertain decision-making, and finally the amygdala, which has been hypothesized to be a generalized vigilance module in the brain.
Now let's move on to the methods of this research. Data was obtained from two studies. First, an fMRI study on regular subjects, and second, an fMRI study on lesion subjects. Let's go over the first study. There were 16 participants, 13 male and 3 female. The mean age was 23.5 years old, and all the participants were undergraduate students. The procedure in Study 1 contained 3 different decision-related treatments. Let's start off with the first one, the card deck treatment. In the fMRI machine, participants were shown 2 options. One, they could bet on either the red or purple card in hopes to get a $30 reward, or they could choose option 2 and get a sure payoff of $3. Because we want to test for different types of uncertainty, there were 2 versions of option 1, ambiguity and risk. In ambiguity, participants did not know the proportions of winning cards in each deck. It is like betting on the unknown. In risk, participants know the proportions of winning cards. Let's move on to the second part of the procedure, the knowledge treatment. Here, participants had 2 options again. In option 1, they read a statement and had to say if it was true or false. If they got it right, they won $10. In option 2, they get a sure payoff of $3. In option 1, there were 2 types of statements. Ambiguous statements like Lesotho is a larger area than Guyana, and risk statements like Michael Jordan played in more than 1,200 games in the NBA. Now we move on to the last treatment for Study 1, informed opponent. Again, the participant can choose between 2 options, a sure payoff of only $3, or to play against an opponent in hopes to get $10 if they win. There were 2 types of opponents. Ambiguous opponents had more knowledge than the participant by being allowed to sample 3 cards before choosing the colored card they want. Risk opponents had the same amount of knowledge, so they were not able to sample the deck. This study used a block-related design with 48 trials, 24 risk and 24 ambiguous. The scanning run was about 15 minutes. The analysis of this study contained pre-processing through slice time artifacts, realignment, normalization to the neurological coordinates of MNI space, spatial smoothing, and the first two images were discarded due to magnetization reaching a steady state. Afterwards, they conducted a GLM through a one-way ANOVA to find areas of joint significance, as well as t-tests.
Results for Study 1 found that in all three treatment conditions, ambiguous situations produced more activation in the orbital frontal, amygdala, and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex regions. These results are shown to the right, where there is time on the x-axis and percent signal change on the y-axis, with the blue lines indicating the ambiguity condition and the green line indicating the risk condition. So that you can see in the top panels, in the amygdala, there was more activation for the ambiguity condition, as well as the orbital frontal cortex located in the lower panels. Results for the ambiguous situations line up really nicely with existing literature, hypothesizing that the orbital frontal cortex is involved in the integration of emotional and cognitive information. The amygdala is involved in reacting to emotional information, while the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is involved in modulating amygdala activity. For the risky situation, in all three treatment conditions, it was found that the dorsal striatum was more activated, and this is again shown to the right-hand side, where the green line indicates risk and the blue line indicates ambiguity. And this fits nicely with previous literature suggesting that the dorsal striatum is involved in reward prediction. Another important thing to highlight is that there were time course differences. So early on we saw activation of the amygdala and the orbital frontal cortex, whereas later we saw activation of the dorsal striatum. And these differences suggest that there are kind of two systems working within the brain. The first being a vigilance or evaluation system, which grades uncertainty, and the later being a reward anticipation system.
To better understand these results, researchers did a second study involving participants with brain lesions. There were 5 participants with orbital frontal cortex lesions and 7 participants with temporal lobe lesions. All of them had the same neuropsychological states in terms of memory, IQ, arithmetic ability, and none of them had aphasia or depression. The procedure was very similar to the card deck treatment that we talked about earlier.
Compared to the temporal lobe damaged patients, the orbital frontal cortex damaged patients did not have any differences in brain pattern activation between the ambiguous and risky situation conditions. This suggests that the orbital frontal cortex is important in distinguishing degrees of uncertainty.
This study has a few important implications. One, it suggests that there is a neural system for evaluating general uncertainty. Secondly, it disconfirms decision theory at both the behavioral and neural level, and it does this by demonstrating that confidence regarding probabilities does influence choice. And finally, this study introduces the concept of varying degrees of uncertainty, which has been missing from previous studies of reward and decision making.
There were some limitations in the study. In Study 1, all participants were young adults with higher education, and there were only 3 females. This is a very select population, and it makes it difficult to generalize to other populations. Also, only 13 of the 16 participants completed the informed opponent treatment. This smaller sample size causes problems with power, effect size, and the interpretation of results. Lastly, all fMRI studies have technique limitations, sometimes with the equipment or other times with the analysis.
Future directions for further research include exploring the neural basis of reward and how this differs when it comes to ambiguous and risky decision making. And this kind of relates back to the preference that most people show to make risky decisions over ambiguous ones. And the second direction would be to look at the neurophysiological changes that occur in gambling disorder, which has now been recognized as a disorder in the DSM-5.
So next time you're making a decision of uncertainty, whether that be deciding what graduate program to go into, or if you should attend your 8:30 morning lecture, now you know that there are internal neural systems that help you make decisions at varying uncertainties like risk and ambiguity.